What exactly is the Classical Greek era and why was it so important to literature? Well, let's get a little history before we start jumping into any conclusions. The term Classical Greece refers to the period between the Persian Wars at the beginning of the 5th century BC and the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC. The Classical period was an era of war and conflict, first between the Greeks and the Persians, then between the Athenians and the Spartans. And no, we're not talking about the 300 and Gerard Butler and the rise of the Spartans.
This is Sparta!
Yikes. Anyway, besides the Parthenon and Greek tragedy, Greece brought us the historian Herodotus, the physician Hippocrates, and the philosophers Plato, Aristotle. It also brought us the political reforms that ancient Greece has paid contribution to the modern world, the system known as democratia, or rule by the people. During this era, you have some idea of what it would be like. Ever watched Hercules? Well, that's only part of what the Greek era was. Yes, there were gods, goddesses, heroes, monsters, legends, myths, etc. But there was more to the Greek era, more in-depth stuff that simple people never realized could be important. Over a period of more than 10 centuries, the ancient Greeks created a literature of such excellence and brilliance that has rarely been equaled. In poetry, tragedy, comedy, and history, Greek writers created masterpieces that have inspired, influenced, and challenged readers ever since. One of the greatest forms of literature that the Greeks have shown us is Epic was written in dactylic hexameter in a dignified and elevated style. It typically begins with an invocation to a muse and contains elaborate descriptions, similes, and speeches. It tells of major events of historical importance, and its characters are noble, humble, and sometimes obnoxious. Certain epics were written in the 8th or 9th century BCE. A blind poet named Homer made two of the best-known epic poems of ancient Greece, called the Iliad and the Odyssey, which we have read before. Remember about a guy who cheats on his wife, lies to everyone, and takes more than 10 years to complete a journey of realization of himself or something like that? And the Iliad, also a part of the Trojan War, where the Greeks won over the Trojans by emerging from a gigantic force and ended up conquering most of the Trojan society. Another form of literature that the Greeks were able to achieve was drama. You must know, the Greeks excelled in drama. They wrote both comedies and tragedies. Comedies are amusing and have happy endings. Tragedies are serious and sad. Tragedies, fate or some flaw lead downfall of the main character. Great player of ancient Greece was Sophocles. His most famous play is a tragedy called Oedipus the King. Everyone knows Oedipus, the guy who killed his father, married his mother, and lived the rest of his life blind. He was so ashamed of himself he gouged his eyes out. The ideas of fate and tragic flaws continue to inspire writers today, and both comedy and tragedy remain the basic forms of drama. Now on to the one you have all probably heard in your history classes. Philosophy played a huge role in the classical Greek era that also became important in the subject of history too. Philosophy was most inspired by three writers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, were the most influential of the ancient Greek philosophers, and they focused their attention more on the role of the human being than on the explanation of the material world. The inspiration of philosophy was mostly inspired by the growth in industrialization and the basic forms of human morals, nature, and beliefs. And now we come to the end of the classical Greek era. The eventual Spartan victory in the Peloponnesian War meant that Athens lost its political primacy, but Athenian culture life, the essence of classical Greece, continued apace in the 4th century BC. By the second half of the century, however, disorder reigned within the former Athenian Empire. This disorder made possible the conquest of Greece by the Macedonian kings Philip II and his son Alexander the Great, a conquest that marked the end of the classical period. Conquest of Alexander the Great changed the course of ancient history. The center of gravity of the Greek world moved from the self-containment of city-states to a more larger territory that spanned the entire coast of the eastern Mediterranean. Alexander's conquest placed many diverse cultures under a common hegemony and Greek influence around the Mediterranean and southern Asia, paving the way for the distinct Hellenistic culture that followed his death. Alexander's tutor was the Greek philosopher Aristotle, and as Alexander traveled, he spread Greek thought and culture in his wake, thus Hellenizing those he conquered. In the past and now to present day, many writers have used themes and characters from Greek mythology. They include William Shakespeare, the American playwright Eugene O'Neill, and the Irish novelist James Joyce. The ideas of fate and tragic flaws continue to inspire writers today. The classical Greek era was an inspiring time of fate, destiny, glory, pride, and well-being. The works of Greek literature were inspired by these characteristics, and although some works of Greek literature seemed very compelling, weird, and very shocking, it taught a great lesson to those who have read literature of the Greek era and also affect those who have read it today.